Please, the chairs.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. I think it's going to be pretty interesting. It's a small topic, the future of education, not at all important for the world. I wanted to begin with the pandemic. And Mary, maybe we can begin with you. I wanted to ask you about, fundamentally, what has the pandemic changed in terms of the way we view education?
Well, the pandemic changed the entire view of how children live their lives, how we deliver education, and I think how we look at the highway ahead, because there's no going back to where we were without significant learnings that need to be put into place. So stress and anxiety and in childhood, unparalleled heights. And I think now with the big push to fill the learning gap, children are being stressed, teachers are being stressed, and you can't learn if you're dysregulated. So this is the big change, to try and support children's mental health so that they can learn.
I want to stick with that for a second. What does it, when you say that you can't learn when you're dysregulated, what do you mean by that?
I can't really hear you.
What do you mean by, is that better? What do you mean by the notion that children can't learn if education has been dysregulated, or if they've been dysregulated?
Yeah, well, I guess we think about the brain. When children's cortisol level is high, that's the stress hormone, it precludes their taking in new information so that they're not open to learning. And poor teachers are being pressured to close the learning gap. And it's not happening very quickly at all. So the work that we're involved with is helping children learn how to self-regulate so that they can learn.
Okay. Martin, let's jump to you. How do you view things coming out of the pandemic? What has the pandemic changed?
Pandemic had a biggest souvenir for higher education, and the main thing was universities and colleges learned that they can change if they want to. And in a matter of 3 weeks, the entire higher education started changing, and they started fighting with a lot of the bureaucracies that they had internally for years and years. Change of curriculum, change use of technology, all the procurement and everything they had. In a matter of 3 weeks, they changed. And it was fascinating to see, because that muscle of the change is now a state, and I can see now they're using more technology, engagement become more important. And one of the biggest thing that it came up more was about that education is not only about the content that you provide. For example, if you are teaching coding, it's not only about the content of the coding, and there are a lot of competency-based, time management, learning how to learn, discipline, teamwork, and a lot of things. During the pandemic, it kind of surfaced out that those are the very, very important aspects of higher education that universities and colleges have to provide. And we've seen some of them were lacking, some of them was leading, and that muscle also stayed with higher education. Generally speaking, I think this was something that very, very good. Universities and colleges learned a lot, professors learned about a lot about it. Yeah.
That's really interesting, Zane. Let's come to you. You're 18, so you spent the last couple of years of high school in the middle of the pandemic, right?
Yes.
So what lessons did you learn? What do you think, how do you think the pandemic changed education?
I think what it did was it provided a lot of new agency for a lot of students, meaning you were now in a position where you were learning virtually, teachers were giving information to you, but you could also explore new topics that you didn't have the ability to explore in normal education. And so you saw YouTube be a big unlock for students. You saw even the platform TikTok be a good unlock for students, where now there was some education technology opportunities there. So for me, it was a good opportunity to take more agency over my learning, and I think you saw more people across the US, more people across other countries as well, start to take more agency there. What I do think is interesting as part of where the pandemic might have slowed down education is right now I'm actually working in India and thinking about how can I help give literacy to students in India. And for students in poor, illiterate rural households, they had learned their mother tongue language, Kannada, or other mother tongue languages, and then they were starting to learn English. And what happened through the process of the pandemic was because they were in these poor, rural, illiterate households with no technology, the digital divide really exploited them. And now, for most of these students, they're 3/4 behind on their instruction. So for them, there was a massive negative externality as a result of the pandemic. And so now, I'm really optimistic outside of that just because we're starting to see access increase. So what I mean by that is the number of smartphones in India has 20x since 2010. And it'll be around 95% by 2040. So that's something to get excited about. And then when we look at the internet access, that's going to be across India as well. Rural internet access is going to cross urban internet access by 2025. So the people that we're targeting, the people that have now been 3 to 4 quarters behind on their instruction, they'll have the opportunity to get back.
So I want to come to each of you with a question around what lessons we've learned in terms of recognizing that each individual child is quite different. And some thrived during the pandemic in the environment of being at home. For some, I think, children, it's fair to say, that was incredibly helpful for a whole host of reasons. For others, that was really unhelpful, and you mentioned the negative impact in India. How do we keep that idea, that realization, I guess, that each individual child is going to benefit from different types of education? How do we build that into our systems around the world best? Maybe, Mary, if we start with you.
Yeah, I think this idea of acknowledging the uniqueness of children is something that blossomed during the pandemic. And because so many children were learning it at home and were independent and were online, many of those children blossomed with that freedom. And for children, and there's quite a high percentage of children who are bullied, this was salvation. So I think we learned many things, but to respect children's own insights and metacognition, if you like, in understanding how they learn best, many children came to appreciate that they prefer independent study. And in school, we typically do group work. And for many children, that's torture and it's not productive. And suddenly it became acceptable to do that. But I think also we have to make sure that when children are recognized as being social learners, it's not that they're fooling around. It's that they learn in an exchange, and we have to recognize that is a viable methodology for learning. And you know, we have to watch that we don't get so enraptured with the online learning that we forget the person.
Right. Martin, do you see governments around the world taking this lesson and building it into education systems?
No.
Why not?
I don't think like they catch up really. As part of it, we started seeing some government like movement in terms of like finding the software and do a group buying, and I think within the first quarter they completely dropped it and it went to different institutions to do something about it. Like maybe to add some color to what you said, there are like 5 pillars of disruption comes to education in content, personalization, assessment, financial access, and if I want to talk about the personalization,
right.
The most important thing about the personalization is about how to use AI to really like see the engagement of the students and how the students are learning and what's the best method, because you mentioned a little bit about it, but also like regardless of remote, regardless of online, offline, what type of content of education it is, we know as a fact that not everyone learns the same and not everyone should learn the same. And I'm very optimistic about use of AI in different like parameters of finding what's the best way of teaching different people and what's the best way of assessing that learning from different people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Zane, what about you? Do you see governments, I mean, what's the situation in India, for instance? Have they adapted? Have they learned the lessons that coming out of the pandemic?
India's education, I think, has been more driven by apps like Byju's, for example. So Byju's, they've done a phenomenal job at overtaking most of what's happening in the education technology sector of India. And as far as what I think the future of education looks like, specifically in terms of personalization, I think number one, it's much higher touch. And so part of what we learned throughout the pandemic was we need maybe less focus on the teaching of a topic and more focus on how do we turn these teachers into coaches. Coaches that can actually help maximize the potential of a student versus just teach what's in the textbook or teach what's on a slide deck. So I think that's one point that's interesting. Another point that I think is interesting to note is as part of the mass COVID relief bill that President Biden signed, $1.9 trillion, $122 billion of that is being allocated to elementary and secondary education. And why that's interesting is because I think part of this future of education that's more personalized to the student includes a lot of industry development. And so what does that mean, industry development? Right now, 52% of students in high school are prepared for college. 66% of students in college are prepared for a job. So as you do more education, you feel less and less prepared for the real world, which is counterintuitive to how we would think about education. So if you look at, for example, AP Computer Science, right now the National Science Federation, a governmental agency, is the one that is creating the curriculum for AP Computer Science. Whereas for me, what's more intuitive is you have Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, some of the best companies in the world. They're the ones that are deciding what high schools, what middle schools start to learn. And then from there, we work middle, high school, up to college. So now we take this gap where 66% of college students don't feel ready to go into a job, and we have this mergence between industry and between school. Now we can start to bridge this gap and actually help students prepare for the real world. And I think it comes from industry and less from government, but the point to mention there is $122 billion is a lot of capital that we could be allocating to a partnership like this.
Mary, do you see that connection between industry and companies and schools beginning to happen? And do you agree that that's a good way to go?
Well, my first choice would be a melding of schools and medical health services, like public health services. I think it's problematic if businesses have a significant role in education. We have seen that go south. And I think in terms of protecting children from being pitched to, I think you have a sacred trust in education, and those children, I mean, childhood is really the springtime of humanity, and do we want to soil that? I don't think so.
Tell us a little bit more about the connection that you see between the health system and education. That's interesting.
Well, I think it's one of the big findings from the pandemic that suddenly the whole world was aware that children have a mental health crisis, because we don't think of children as having vulnerability with mental health, just physical health. And I think it was the marriage of classroom teachers appreciating a new need in children, and the children are our most resilient and I think best resource for the future. And suddenly that discussion is there. It's not just about making sure the children have their polio shots in school. It's about making sure that their mental health issues are being addressed in school, because children who are feeling sad, sick, or lonely, and that's the whole medical trio, are, like I was saying earlier, they're not receptive to learning. So I think schools could very easily become where public health services are delivered.
Martin, I saw you nodding when Mary started to talk about that combination of health and education. What are your thoughts on that?
So what we do, we help international students from all over the world to come to Canada, US, Australia, and UK to study. And during the pandemic, something good happened that someone, for example, from India or from Philippines, they were taking the classes online in Canada, on Canada time zone, so it was like more synchronous. Mental health really came up because like schools started like noticing like the engagement first, it went very up, the productivity went very up, but very fast it started coming down to the level to the fall 2020, the fall off started, and almost if you talk to all the professors, they're very unhappy about the results. As much as 40% decline in learning, they're talking about it. So it means like for about a year and a half, we lost a huge productivity of learning and teaching to these students. And I think that was one of the things I think a government like Canada that were very conservative about COVID. They've done good. The first people that they brought back, they said like we need our students to go back because that decline that was very, very tough. The other thing I think that it came very obvious for the parents. You know how parents normally they're very protective of their children, and they call it like new generation of parents. They want to like make sure the kids never like hit the reality. But I think during the COVID they really learned that if the kid they can do their own job or not. Like I'm surprised that even the highest schools we're talking about, over 60% of the students, they don't finish their homework. 60% of the students, they don't finish their homework. And that's terrible think about it. These are like students at high school, set aside like set aside the students at their grade 5, 6, or 7. So I think there are a lot to learn, and there are a lot to like for years to analyze. And I'm pretty sure a lot of the data comes up, and people are going to learn about it and find the new systems to practice.
That example that you gave, the example that you gave of students in India, say, studying in Canada, and their engagement went way down because they all had to be on Canadian time.
Yes.
But there's a fairly obvious solution to that, which is to make education asynchronous, right? So is that happening more and more? Because what I'm hearing a lot from all of you is the need for flexibility. Is that happening?
I have a quick contrarian view just to what both of them mentioned. So I think when we talk about mental health in schools, I think the way that we're talking about it is more reactive and less proactive. And so by reactive, I mean it's after someone decides to come into a nurse or they say that they have a mental health issue, then we decide to address it. Whereas what we should be doing is thinking about what needs to be true, so very first principles-based thinking, what needs to be true for students to thrive. And then after we answer that question, we think about what are the best ways that we can incorporate it into learning, so now we can be more proactive versus being reactive. And so how do we actually make that happen? Well, for example, we can think about mindsets that students might need to learn in order to have some form of self-awareness, to build a relationship with themselves, to understand these fundamental skills. So they can learn that while they're in elementary school, they can learn that while they're really, really young. Whereas I think what's happening more right now in the middle high school level is we wait for someone to come to us and then we decide to address the issue.
The completion rate of asynchronous courses that is self-managed by students is less than 5%. Means only 1 out of 20 students finish the course. And we are not talking about passed or failed, getting A+ or B or C. We are talking about just finishing the course. 1 out of 20. So now 19 out of 20 left. The biggest problem of asynchronous education is right now engagement and community. Like community of students together, community of students, the engagement between the students and the lecturer, the teacher, but also the engagement, like getting a real-time feedback. Like in a class, like a teacher or someone, they can get a feedback if the students is engaged or not. And that is, it seems like our current technology and the thing that we are doing, this is absolutely completely missed in current asynchronous education. There are some apps like Duolingo and the language learning or some like a math learning that they do like a better job, but still the completion rate is less than 10%.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, and I think in the introduction there was a request for questions. I have one question here, which actually is for you, Zain. That in the intro you mentioned the Knowledge Society. Yeah. Someone wants to know what is that?
Yeah. So the Knowledge Society is a program for 13 to 17-year-olds who want to train themselves to solve the world's biggest problems. So if you think about current education, right now, most of it, the objective function of a high school education or any education is to think about how do we get students into college, and then from college, how do we get students into jobs. And I think that there are several students who want to self-select into a different path and do something different and think more about how do I create a phenomenal, profound impact on the world, something that I can be really, really proud of. And so that's what TKS does. So it trains students to solve real-world problems. We have students focused on vaccine distribution, students focused on male birth control, students focused on the blood supply chain, students focused on self-driving cars. I'm focused on illiteracy and augmented reality education. We have students building biotech companies. So there are students doing so many interesting things while they're still 13 to 17-year-olds. And just to talk about this a little more, so the first year of the program, it's called Innovate. And Innovate is where students learn about technology and science. So they'll learn about artificial intelligence, augmented reality, blockchain. And then on the science side, they learn about longevity. Second year program is called Activate, where they really understand what the world is. They understand more about problems. And then they also learn about themselves. And so through that process, you can now start to train people to be unicorn people. So unicorn companies, they impact, or they have a $1 billion valuation. Unicorn people is how do we get one person to impact 1 billion people?
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. So I asked you all yesterday to come up with one word that you think we need to keep in mind and embrace, in a sense, as a concept for when it comes to the future of education. Mary, let's start with you. What's your word?
Empathy.
Empathy. And why?
I think it's the ultimate human trait, and we now understand from all sorts of business studies and education studies that if you don't have the capacity to connect with yourself and the other, you are going to be a withering soul. And it's also about your morality.
Right.
And we know the climate, if you don't have empathy, you don't care about the people on the other. So it relates to everything. But in education, the ability to have empathy allows you to really understand the other and take advantage of what's being taught.
Okay. Martin, in 25 seconds.
Global access to education, global access to education. It is every single human being right to get access to education, and it is every single human being responsibility to make sure all the students around the world have access to education. So it's my responsibility, it's your responsibility to make sure that students in Africa, in Sri Lanka, in USA, in Canada, everyone have access to education, because education is a human right and we need to do that, and the result of that coming back to us.
Okay, and Zane, let's finish with you.
think
You were most recently a student, so last word to you.
I think the word is parallel. And so just to use a quick analogy, I think right now, I don't know how many of you guys have moved recently or have ever moved to a different state, but if you think about a packing box, there's a limit, right? You can only add so much to the packing box before it overflows, or a bathtub, or any one of these other models. And I think what I mean by that is we can't continue creating more additive systems to education where we add more and more. Let's add this course. Let's give teachers something else. I think we need to think about a parallel system, one that totally disrupts what we currently think education should be.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to the great audience for listening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.